and why there was so much discussion of the legislative branch in the Constitutional Convention. One question that had to be answered was, what is the appropriate basis for representation? Okay. One theory at the time, and some of those involved in the constitutional debates, argued that Congress should represent the people's interests, and therefore Congress should be representative of the people and be based on population. Others argued that we are all equal, and therefore representation in the Congress should be equal, and should be equally represented on the basis of states, with each state equally represented, as was the case under the national government formed by the Articles of Confederation, which the Constitutional Convention was seeking to replace. This debate was ultimately resolved through a compromise. The delegates found a solution in the creation of a bicameral legislature, a legislature consisting of two houses, with the lower house, the House of Representatives, representing the people and being elected directly by the people and based on population, and the upper chamber, the Senate, based on equal representation of the states, with each state receiving 2 members of the Senate. A second issue that had to be confronted before we could frame a national legislature was how to encourage representation that would promote the national interest above selfish or more local interests. Or as it was often described, how do you have democracy yet avoid the excesses of democracy, avoid the problem of faction, avoid a legislature that would pursue its own selfish interests rather than the interests of the people as a whole? And this was part of a broader debate that was going on at the time, a debate over what is the nature of a representative. One theory held that a representative should be a delegate or ambassador for the people that they represent. A representative should be an individual who essentially acts as an agent for the people who elected them, reflecting their views and opinions in the Congress, basically serving as a voice that expressed what the people back home believed or wanted. Another theory argued no. The purpose of a representative is to be a trustee of the people. The purpose of a representative is essentially to filter public opinion and make judgments about what's in the best interest of the nation. Because by pursuing what's in the national interest, by pursuing what's in the broader public interest, that is the best way that you represent the interests of a free people. Every member of Congress has to balance the role in some way of delegate or trustee. The question was, how do you ensure this balance? How do you encourage legislators to think more about the broader public interest? One solution the Constitution came up with was to have regular elections of members of the House in large congressional districts. This is the argument that Madison made in the famous Federalist No. 10. By having representatives who reflected larger constituencies, you would tend to get individuals of greater merit, individuals of greater civic virtue, who tended to appeal to many different interests, and thus, in order to gain the number of votes needed to be elected, would have to appeal to different interests, just not one selfish interest or faction or group. Okay. This would help to ensure, at a minimum, that Congress consisted of a very diverse group of people. By having a second house that would also have to pass any bills that came out of the lower house, you added it a check on the House of Representatives. If the people's representatives did become subject to some passion of the moment, you could have another body consider the bill and consider whether it was in the public interest. This is what the role of the Senate was originally conceived to be. In order to help the Senate perform this function, the framers of the Constitution tried to make it as different from the House as possible, yet still maintain it as a representative assembly. Thus, you see in the Senate individuals who are selected for 6-year terms, not just 2-year terms, with only 1/3 elected every 2 years, so that some popular passion of the moment won't lead to a majority in the Senate as it might in the House. The qualifications for office are a little stricter to be a United States Senator, hoping that you would get someone who is perhaps older and a bit wiser. Thus, the framers recognized that auxiliary precautions might be necessary. And they also realized that they needed to confront a third issue, which was, how do you create a legislature that is representative and yet effective, that has the power to do what a national legislature needs to do, yet not give it so much power that it acts tyrannically, like the British Parliament? This was one of the reasons why there was so much discussion of the powers of Congress in the Constitutional Convention, because the power to make law is a very broad and undefined power. We can make law about anything. And the framers understood that you could use the law to violate the people's rights. How do you control this power? The framers of the Constitution came up with a number of measures. First, they enumerated the powers of Congress. They listed in Article 1 of the Constitution the areas in which Congress would have the power to legislate. In order to ensure that Congress would have the power to make laws on those areas important to a national government, but at the same time not have unrestrained ability to make law in any area. By doing this, one of the things that the Constitution did was distinguish between the role of the national legislature and the state legislatures. And what it did was therefore establish what we now know as the principle of federalism, that certain areas of legislative concern are for the national legislature and Congress, others are to be left to the state or local legislature. Third, the Constitution sets up a system of separation of powers. John Locke, in the Second Treatise of Government, had noted that you need to separate powers. It's not a good idea to have the body that makes law also be the body that carries out law. Congress can never act alone. It always has to rely, to some extent, on the other branches of government to fulfill its responsibilities. Congress is thus a complex institution, reflecting the complicated character of representative democracy. It is the fundamental authority in a representative government, but it's forced to share power with the president and be subject to review by the courts at the national level and divide the lawmaking power with the state legislatures that it works with. As a result, we have a Congress that is designed to fulfill its dual role, and one that is designed to fulfill its purpose, which is to safeguard the liberties of the people through the rule of law, and to serve as the voice of the people in the making of law, to ensure that the voice of the people is always heard in the way our nation is governed. Thank you.
I want to address the question for a few minutes about how you go about understanding this institution of the United States Congress. When you go in to vote for a member of Congress, there's a title there. It says United States Representative. It doesn't say United States Congressman or Congresswoman. It says United States Representative. And that's a very key point to understand, because the Congress of the United States